In 7 minutes, one battleship will destroy another, and the loser will never see who is firing at him. It is the night of the 15th of November, 1942. A narrow stretch of water north of Guadalcanal. The sailors already have a name for this place. They call it Ironbottom Sound because too many sunken ships lie on its floor. On the bridge of the Japanese cruiser Atago stands Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, and he lifts a large ship's binocular to his eyes. No one else in the world has optics like these. Their lenses pull the shape of a ship out of total darkness at a range of many kilometers, where an ordinary eye sees only black. Hold on to this instrument. In a few hours it will fail its owner at the one moment that matters, and it will fail an entire fleet along with him. Kondo has every reason to feel calm. For half a year the Japanese fleet has been beating the Americans at night. In the tubes of his destroyers wait 90 torpedoes, the finest in this war. And above all, the Japanese are certain of one thing. The Americans keep their heavy battleships with the carriers and take them away into the dark at night. So the strait ahead will hold cruisers and destroyers at most. Those the Japanese fleet knows how to handle. Kondo is leading the battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers and 9 destroyers. He counts his own ships and the ones his scouts have reported. By every reckoning, he is the stronger force. The count is correct only on paper, because down in the darkness, below the reach of his searchlights, comes a ship his lookouts will never find. Inside that ship, in a cramped room, a green light glows. Bright dots crawl across a round screen. Each dot on it stands for a Japanese ship. The screen sees them all, and Kondo cannot see the screen. Here is the thought worth holding through the whole of this. Between seeing and finding lies a gulf. Kondo and his lookouts can see in the dark better than anyone alive. The ship across from them can find without seeing. Tonight it will become clear which of those 2 skills is the stronger. By dawn, one of the 2 new battleships in this fight will take no serious hole in her hull and will lose not a single man. The other will burn from bow to stern, and both of those battleships will be American. The best night fleet in the world is about to lose to an enemy it cannot even properly make out. Only one question remains. How is that possible at all? To understand why Kondo entered this strait with such confidence, you have to see the war through his eyes. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese fleet was the finest night fighter in the world, and it was proven not by words, but by sunken steel. In August, in these very waters, Japanese ships slipped up on Allied cruisers in the dark and sank 4 heavy ships in under an hour, taking almost no damage themselves. That was when the strait earned its name, Ironbottom Sound. Every Japanese commander entering here at night remembered that score. Their advantage rested on 3 things, and the fleet had built each of them over decades. The first was eyes. Lookouts were chosen for the sharpness of their sight and trained for months in what no instrument can be taught. To tell one shade of black from another, to look with the edge of the eye, to catch movement at the far margin of the field, to find a ship by the way it blots out the stars along the horizon. To those eyes was added that heavy optics on its deck mounts, gathering light where a Western sailor saw a solid wall of dark. In the Japanese staff rooms, it was put in a single phrase: "Our eye reaches farther than the American instrument." Tonight, that phrase would be tested for real. The second was the torpedo, heavy, running on pure oxygen. It left almost no trail of bubbles, carried a warhead that could break a cruiser in half, and covered a distance the West believed impossible. By this night, the Americans knew almost nothing about it, and so they feared it less than they should have. Later, the torpedo would be given a famous name. For the men who met it in the strait, the name would come too late. The third was confidence. Half a year of victories in the dark had convinced the Japanese commanders that the night belonged to them, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Confidence that has never once been punished stops a man from ever questioning it. 2 nights before this, the same war entered this same strait, but in its older form, when both sides fought blind. That first night shows what a sea battle looked like without radar. And against it, you can see exactly what the Washington was about to change. On the night of the 13th of November, Admiral Abe steamed toward Guadalcanal with 2 battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima, ringed by cruisers and destroyers. His task was the one that would later fall to Kondo. Come in close and tear up the airstrip at Henderson Field with heavy guns. In the magazines of his battleships lay special bombardment shells packed with incendiary shrapnel. One such salvo across the parking rows could burn the airfield to nothing. Coming to meet Abe was an American force under Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan. 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers. It was plainly weaker than 2 battleships, but there was nothing else at hand, and Callaghan led what he had. What followed would later be called the most chaotic night battle of the whole war. 2 columns of ships drove into one another in the dark, at almost point-blank range, and mixed together, ships firing at silhouettes without always knowing friend from enemy. One American destroyer passed so close to the battleship Hiei that she could not depress her guns far enough, and hammered the Japanese superstructure at arm's length with light weapons. Searchlights flared and died at once, taking their crews with them. In that brawl, 2 American admirals were killed, Daniel Callaghan and Norman Scott. Both were struck down on the bridges of their ships within minutes. Never again in the whole naval war would the American fleet lose 2 admirals in one action. It was a terrible price. But the Americans, by dying, did the job. Callaghan's flagship and the ships with her had beaten the battleship Hiei hard enough that she lost her steering and her way. Abe could not stand the slaughter and pulled his battleships out without ever firing on the airfield. And the next morning, the crippled Hiei, limping near the island, was caught by aircraft from that same Henderson field she had come to destroy. They worked her over all day and sank her. She was the first Japanese battleship lost in the entire war. Remember what that victory looked like. The Americans stopped the Japanese bombardment at the cost of 2 admirals and several ships, in a blind, close-range brawl where everything came down to luck and a willingness to die. It was eyes against eyes, and neither side held any real advantage in sight. 2 nights later, the Washington would enter this same strait, and the same battle would go a completely different way, because one side would finally be able to find in the dark, and the other would not. There remained the question of what Kondo was risking a battleship for in this tight water. It all came down to one airstrip. Henderson Field, the airfield on Guadalcanal. The American Marines had taken it from the Japanese construction crews in August and had held it ever since. By day, aircraft rose from that strip and sank any Japanese ship that came near the island in the light. As long as the airfield worked, Japanese reinforcements could not reach their own soldiers on the shore, and those soldiers were already starving. The conclusion was hard and simple. The airfield had to be knocked out, and only the main guns of a battleship could do that job for certain. Admiral Yamamoto was furious after Abe's failure, and he had no intention of stopping. He relieved Abe and ordered Kondo to build a fresh force around the Kirishima and finish the work on the night of the 15th. The task was unchanged. Suppress the airfield, cover the landing. Kondo had 1 battleship left, an old one, launched back in the First World War. But for this strait, even she was enough, if that assumption held, about where the Americans kept their heavy ships at night. The assumption was wrong. While Kondo was turning his ships toward the island, 100 miles to the south, 2 ships were steaming north that, by Japanese logic, could not be there. They were the new American battleships Washington and South Dakota, and with them, 4 destroyers. They had been stripped from guarding Admiral Halsey's last surviving carrier and thrown into the strait, because there was nothing else left to throw. The force was thrown together in a hurry. These 6 ships had never once operated together, and the destroyers had been picked in haste. On a single count, they had more fuel left. On the bridge of the Washington flew the flag of a man the Japanese knew nothing about. Quiet, sparing with words, He understood one new thing better than anyone in the American fleet, and his enemy was not thinking about that thing at all. In the strait, everything was still unfolding the way Kondo had planned. His lookouts, with the finest optics in the world, stared into the dark, and the darkness was already holding them in its sights, and it was not aiming with eyes. That new thing was called radar. The instrument sent a radio wave out into the dark. The wave bounced off a steel hull and came back. From the time of the return, the instrument worked out the distance to a ship, and from the direction it worked out where that ship was. All of it was drawn on a round screen in glowing dots. Radar did not care whether there was a moon, and the dark did not hinder it. It found a ship where no optics could help. The Japanese had nothing like it that night. Their strength was in eyes and training. American strength was in the instrument. The man on the Washington's bridge was Rear Admiral Willis Lee. It was said of him that he knew more about radar than the radar operators did. He did not merely trust the instrument. He had ordered the screens moved close to his own bridge so he could watch the shape of the battle with his own eyes in real time. In 1942, almost no one did this. Lee did. Since the instrument decided this night, it is worth answering the question that asks itself, if radar mattered so much, why did the Japanese not simply build one too? It was not that Japanese engineers were slower. Radar research in Japan was underway, but the fleet did not truly believe in it. For decades, the commanders had bet on the man, on the lookout chosen for his sight, on years of night training, on that powerful optics. That bet worked, and it brought victories, so why change it? Confidence in the old way kept them from investing in the new one. There was a second reason, and a deeper one. Radar was a weapon of industry rather than of craft. For it to decide a battle, it had to be not merely invented, but placed in series on hundreds of ships, with thousands of ordinary operators trained, and a supply of spare parts running. That was within the reach of a country that knew how to make complex machinery in bulk and cheaply. The United States knew how. Japanese military culture prized the rare master above the mass-produced standard, and there lay its strength, but there too lay its weakness. One brilliant lookout is a single man. Radar can be printed. That is why the gap that opened in the strait over 7 minutes was neither an accident nor bad luck. It was inevitable. The two countries had bet on different things. One on exceptional men, the other on serial machinery. That night it became clear whose bet was stronger in a war of machines. Toward midnight, the two forces began to close, and the Washington's radar caught the Japanese first. Before a single Japanese lookout had made out the American shape, Lee already knew how many ships were coming at him and along which bearings. He read the battle off the screen. Here is the first blow of the numbers, and it shows the whole gap. The best Japanese lookout, with the finest optics in the world, found a ship at night at a range of a few thousand meters. A fine result for the human eye. The Washington's radar held the Japanese ships on its screen at nearly twice that range, and it kept holding them there, even when they hid in the shadow of Savo Island. While the Japanese were still peering into the dark, the Americans had already trained their guns. But in the real battle, things did not go as smoothly as they did on the screen, and the first to pay for it were not the battleships. 4 destroyers led the American column: the Walke, the Benham, the Preston, and the Gwin. Not one of them was built to fight a battleship or a heavy cruiser. Their work that night was simpler and harder. Go first, find the enemy with their own hulls, and take the blow that would otherwise fall on the Washington and the South Dakota. The first into trouble was the Preston. Japanese shells struck her boiler rooms, and the men standing watch there were killed at once, every one of them. Her after funnel came down across the torpedo mounts. The deck was awash in burning wreckage, and her forward guns jammed in their train. Her captain, Max Storms, saw that the ship was beyond saving and gave the order to abandon her. In under a minute, the Preston rolled onto her side, lifted her bow to the sky, hung there a few minutes, and went down stern first. 116 men went with her, Storms among them. Almost at the same moment came the turn of the Walke. Her captain, Thomas Fraser, was swinging the ship to launch torpedoes when a Japanese torpedo struck her. It blew up her forward magazine and tore away the whole bow of the ship. The lights failed, communications died. A heavy fire took hold. Fraser gave the order to abandon ship, and part of the crew managed to get rafts over the side and into the water. And then came the worst of it. As the Walke went under, her own depth charges detonated in the deep. The blast beneath the surface killed many of the men already floating and believing they had gotten clear. Among the dead was Fraser himself. 80 men were lost with the Walke. The Benham had a piece of her bow torn off by a torpedo. She stayed afloat but was doomed, and her captain did one thing that mattered. He got his entire crew across to a neighboring ship before the Benham sank the following day. Almost no one aboard her was lost. The Gwyn took shells in her engine room and her stern, lost her torpedoes, and dropped out of the fight. In a few minutes, the Washington's screen had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 242 American sailors died that night, and 142 more were wounded. 242 men. That is more than the entire crew of some destroyers, struck off in a single night before the heavy guns of the battleships had even spoken. Later, the captain of every ship in that force would be given the Navy Cross, 2 of them after death. And here is what matters about that price. The Japanese destroyers, in shooting the American screen to pieces, fired far more torpedoes than ever found a target. Every torpedo spent on the Walke or the Preston was a torpedo that did not fly at the battleships. The loss of the 4 destroyers was not wasted. They soaked up with their own hulls the salvo that might otherwise have reached the Washington, and that same Washington, which minutes later would decide the whole night alone, survived in good part because those 4 ships died ahead of her. What came next was something no Japanese shell had done. The second American battleship blinded herself. The South Dakota was steaming behind the Washington. In the thick of the fight, the circuit breakers of her electrical grid began to trip, and her chief engineer, trying to hold the power on, tied them down by hand. It was a mistake. The circuit went into series, and the ship lost all electricity at once, and with it, her gyros, her fire control, and her radar. Later, in the official damage report, the captain of the South Dakota would describe that state in a single line. Without radar, he said, the crew felt as though they had been blindfolded. The men had grown so used to the instrument that without it, the instruments went blind, and the sailors along with them. Then it got worse. Turning to avoid the burning destroyers, the South Dakota swung the wrong way and came out against the backdrop of the fires. Her huge silhouette was lit up by the flames of the burning ships, and in the dark she could be seen clearly for miles. The Japanese switched on their searchlights and opened on her with everything they had. The South Dakota took 27 hits. Her armor held, but her whole superstructure was torn apart, and 39 men died. The blinded battleship could barely answer and simply took the beating. And here Kondo made his great miscalculation. He saw the burning American destroyers. He saw a huge, lit-up battleship taking hit after hit and hardly firing back. From where he stood, the picture was clear. The American squadron was broken. The road to the airfield was open. Kondo gave the order to stop wasting fire on the enemy and to prepare for the main task, the bombardment of Henderson Field. That was what he had come for. In that moment, he was certain he had won the night. In fact, he was looking at only one American battleship, and the second one he could not see at all. Because all this time, the Washington had been running through the dark on the far side of the burning destroyers. The fire that had betrayed the South Dakota worked the other way for the Washington. It hid her. The Japanese were looking at the light, and they did not see the one standing in the shadow behind it. And the Washington's radar already held Kondo's flagship, the cruiser Otago, on its screen, with the battleship Kirishima beside her. Lee waited. He brought his battleship in very close, and then he gave the order to open fire. What follows is the 7 minutes for which this whole story is worth telling. Set the two battleships side by side. The Kirishima was launched back in the First World War. 8 guns of 14-inch caliber, aimed by optics and by eye, with no fire control radar at all. The Washington had entered service in 1941. 9 guns of 16-inch caliber, aimed by radar. She saw a target that her own gunners could barely make out with their eyes. The Washington opened fire at a range of 8,400 yards. By the measure of a sea battle, that is, point blank. In 7 minutes, she threw 75 main battery shells at the Kirishima and about 100 of her secondary shells. Aimed by radar, in the dark, at a target they could barely see. And they hit. From 9 to 20 heavy shells struck the old Japanese battleship, along with about 40 secondary rounds. Here is the physical result of those numbers. The Kirishima's rudder jammed, and the battleship lost control and began to steam in a circle. 2 of her forward turrets were knocked out. Below the waterline, her holes gaped open. She burned and turned back upon herself, unable either to hold a course or to shoot with any effect. All of it was done by an enemy she never managed to properly aim at. Her lookouts, with their finest optics, searched the dark for gun flashes, while the Washington stood in the shadow and fired by the screen. Stop on one object, on the one that decided this night. It was not the biggest ship, nor the bravest crew, nor the most accurate gun. It was a round screen in a cramped room. The radar plot of the Washington. Looking at it was almost dull. Dark glass, a glowing sweep, dots crawling slowly across. No drama. But each dot on that glass was a Japanese ship, and the range, the bearing, the course were worked out on their own and fed to the guns. The man in the room saw the whole battle from above like a chessboard. Now go back to the Japanese bridge, to Admiral Kondo with his binocular. The same one this story began with. While down in the Washington, the green screen calmly tracked his cruiser as one of its dots. Kondo himself stood on an open bridge with the finest optics in the world at his eyes and stared into empty black. The shells were falling nearer and nearer with growing accuracy, and the eyepieces showed him nothing. The finest eyes on the planet searched for the source of the fire and could not find it. In that minute, 30 years of the Japanese bet on the human eye were worth exactly as much as a stare into the darkness that someone is shooting out of. Here is what matters about that screen. It was not one of a kind. The same screen stood on the South Dakota, and screens like it were fitted to every new American battleship. While the Japanese fleet spent years raising rare lookouts with rare eyesight, American factories simply turned the instrument out in series and hung it on everything that left the slipways. One such screen cost the Japanese a battleship, and the Americans had as many of them as they needed. This was not a duel of gunners. This was a duel of who could see. And that same night, aboard the South Dakota, the other side of the gap was shown. The moment one battleship lost her screen to a foolish mistake with the circuit breakers, her crew at once felt as though they had been blindfolded. The same fleet, the same class of ship, with the instrument master of the night. Without it, a blind target in another man's searchlights. If by this point it has become clear to you why the best night fleet in the world lost in the dark, leave a like and subscribe. That is how these forgotten stories of the naval war reach more people. And what comes next is the hardest part, because behind those 7 minutes and behind that dull green screen were living men. The one who gave the order to open fire. The one who had the con of the Washington when 2 destroyers burned ahead and hundreds of men thrashed in the water. And the one for whom the loss of the Kirishima this night would become a disgrace that 2 years later would bring him to another city and to another catastrophe. Go back a few minutes to the moment the South Dakota dropped off the air. On the bridge of the Washington, a great deal now hung on one officer. His name was Lieutenant Ray Hunter, and he had the con of the ship. In the dark ahead of him, this was unfolding. The second battleship had suddenly gone silent and vanished. Dead ahead, 2 destroyers burned, the Walke and the Preston, and in the water among the wreckage, hundreds of men were struggling, while out from behind the island, the Japanese ships came on. Hunter had to make a decision at once, with no time to think. He gave the order to turn left. 2 plain words, left rudder. That turn carried the Washington behind the burning hulks of the destroyers, and the flame came between the battleship and the Japanese. To the Japanese lookouts, the Washington vanished into that light, while from the shadow she saw everything. Later, this night would be described in these terms. While the men at the open station saw the war with their own eyes, with all its horror, with burning bodies and cries from the water, the officers at the radar screen watched the same battle as a calm picture made of dots. The same battle, 2 different worlds. And the winning world was the one where they watched the screen. After the shelling, the Kirishima was doomed. Her rudder was jammed, and she circled slowly, not answering the helm. Fires raged inside her. Water poured into her compartments through the holes below the waterline, and her list grew. The crew fought for the ship, but a jammed rudder could not be freed, and the flooding could not be stopped. The captain of the Kirishima, Sanji Iwabuchi, understood that the ship was beyond saving. Around 3:30 in the morning, he gave the order to abandon her, and destroyers came alongside the sinking battleship to take off her men. Then the Kirishima rolled over and went under, northwest of Savo Island. More than 200 men went down with her. She was one of very few battleships in the entire war sunk in a straight fight by another battleship, and the only Japanese battleship sunk that way. Iwabuchi himself survived, taken off the ship by the destroyers. In that moment, it seemed a rescue. In truth, it was the beginning of another story, and we will come back to it. Here, it is worth being honest about what is known only roughly. How many heavy shells struck the Kirishima, no one can say. The Washington's observers counted about 9, while a Japanese damage control officer later marked as many as 20 on a diagram, including underwater hits that could not be seen from the American side. There is argument, too, about what happened aboard the South Dakota, some calling it a plain error by the chief engineer with the circuit breakers, others suspecting faulty factory wiring, and the exact cause was never fully settled. Even the number of dead on the Kirishima drifts from a little over 200 to 300, depending on the source. That is normal for a night battle, where every man saw only his own patch of dark. None of it changes the shape of the whole, and we will not pass a guess off as a fact. And what of the admiral who, an hour before, had believed he had won the night? The picture before Kondo's eyes was changing fast, and not in his favor. The battleship Kirishima burned and would not answer her helm. One of his destroyers was doomed. And above all, out of the dark somewhere, heavy shells were falling on his ships with a calm accuracy, and Kondo could not tell from where. His lookouts, with the finest optics in the world, searched for the source of the fire and could not find it. The Washington stood in the shadow behind the burning destroyers and stayed invisible. Kondo tried to reach her with torpedoes. His destroyers fired a spread at the Washington, but she turned away and dodged them all, helped both by good handling and by the radar that showed the threat in time. Around midnight, Kondo made his decision and ordered every ship not engaged to withdraw. The bombardment of the airfield he called off. The thing he had entered the strait for did not happen. He led his force away, without ever having seen the ship that broke his whole night. It was the same admiral who an hour earlier had been preparing to shell Henderson Field as a victor. Between those two states lay only 7 minutes of work by a single radar screen. Step back and look at what the night meant for the whole war. The direct result was this: Henderson Field held once more. In the morning, aircraft from that strip and from the carrier Enterprise finished off the Japanese transports carrying the reinforcements, and of 11 transports, almost none reached their goal. The soldiers being carried in to retake Guadalcanal either died or came ashore without gear or supplies. The offensive the whole thing had been staged for came apart. But there was a deeper result. After these November nights, the Japanese fleet stopped bringing its large ships to Guadalcanal. It understood that it was losing battleships and cruisers here for nothing, and it took to supplying its own soldiers by fast destroyer runs at night, in secret. Within a few months, the Japanese gave up the island altogether. Here is what stands behind that turn. The battle for Guadalcanal was decided in large part not by the biggest ship or the bravest crew, but by the instrument. While the Japanese relied on rare men with rare eyesight, the Americans relied on what could be put on every ship in series. Willis Lee would later say it plainly. Their whole superiority that night lay almost entirely in the radar, and in experience, training, and the courage of the men, he said. The Americans held no edge at all over the Japanese. Only the instrument. Say a word about the Washington herself, the ship that stopped a Japanese force alone. She came through that night almost untouched. Dozens of torpedoes were fired at her, and she dodged them all. Not one struck home, and she took no serious hole. And here is the figure that says everything. In that whole battle, not a single man was killed aboard the Washington. She sank an enemy battleship, wrecked a destroyer, drove off 2 heavy cruisers, and came out of the fight without one dead man on board. More than that, the Washington went through the entire Second World War from start to finish, and lost not a single crewman in battle in the whole war. For a large ship that spent so long at the front edge of the Pacific, that is an almost impossible fate. There is a rhyme in it with the theme of the whole story. The Washington won by finding sooner and firing first, while staying invisible herself, rather than by putting herself in the way of a blow and standing up to it. The skill of finding the enemy while remaining unfound saved not only the outcome of the battle, but the lives of her entire crew. Now the man who won this night. The quiet admiral on the Washington's bridge. Willis Lee was an unusual officer. In his youth, he was a champion marksman, and at the Olympic Games of 1920, he took 7 medals, 5 of them gold. He understood accuracy in ballistics as few in the fleet did, and he was among the first to truly believe in radar, back when most still took it for a clever toy. He did not chase glory. He simply did his work better than others, and went deeper into the machinery than others. For that night, Lee was given the Navy Cross. He was made commander of all the fast battleships of the Pacific Fleet, and he went with them through nearly the whole war in the Pacific. And his story ended quietly and sadly, in keeping with the man himself. In 1945, Lee was sent to the Atlantic to lead a unit searching for a defense against the Japanese suicide flyers. And he was at that work to the very end of the war. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August. Lee outlived the enemy he had beaten so many times in the dark by only 10 days. On the 25th of August, 1945, he was being carried by launch to his flagship off the coast of Maine, and in that launch, his heart gave out. He grieved that he had missed the signing of the surrender, and he thought there would be no place for a battleship admiral in the new fleet, where aircraft settled everything. The man who had learned better than anyone to find the enemy in the dark went out almost unnoticed, a few days short of the shared celebration he had done so much to bring near. One thread remains, the fate of the captain of the Kirishima. Sanji Iwabuchi survived that night, but in the Japanese fleet, to survive the loss of your ship was to carry disgrace. He was given a higher rank and set at a shore posting, away from the sea, and for his career it was a dead end. But the war was going worse and worse for Japan, and Iwabuchi's experience was needed again. Late in 1944, he was put in command of the Japanese forces in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. The Americans were already advancing. The senior Japanese general ordered Iwabuchi to leave the city without a fight, so as not to drag nearly 1 million civilians into street battle. Iwabuchi did not obey. He chose to fight in the city to the end. Later, it would be said of that decision plainly that he had never come to terms with the disgrace of the lost battleship and was looking for a chance to redeem it by dying in battle. What happened in Manila in February 1945 became one of the worst tragedies of the war for civilians. In the street fighting and the killings, about 100,000 of the city's people died, and the city was almost completely destroyed. Iwabuchi himself took his own life at the end of the battle. This is the shadow that the night off Guadalcanal cast more than 2 years ahead. The battleship Japan never saw in the dark sank the Kirishima in 7 minutes. And the disgrace of one man who survived it later cost the lives of a whole city. One and the same thread runs from a green screen in the strait to the ruins of Manila. Go back to the beginning, to Admiral Kondo on the bridge of his cruiser, with the finest binocular in the world in his hands. He had the greater number of ships, the best lookouts in the world, the best torpedo of the war, years of night training, and half a year of victories in the dark behind him. By every rule he knew, this night was his. He held at his eyes an optics with no equal anywhere on Earth, and he stared into the darkness that was already firing at him. It showed him nothing. The finest eyes on the planet could not find the ship that was killing him. He lost this night to an enemy he never managed to properly aim a gun at. His strength was in seeing in the dark better than anyone. The one who won was the one who did not look with his eyes at all. If this story landed for you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There will be more forgotten stories of the Naval War here, where the outcome was decided somewhere no one was watching for it. Thank you for staying to the end.